Money sat in my hand, but it was my own son who snapped the bone of that hand. The night was quiet until the front door slammed open. My kitchen had always been a refuge, a place where I nursed coffee at dawn or sat alone in the hush of midnight. That evening, the weak yellow lamp above the table flickered as Michael stormed in, his wife Samantha trailing behind him. Their faces were set hard, determined, and it took me only a second to realize why they were here. The ticket rested in my palm, folded and creased from the hours I'd carried it. $79 million, a miracle. For a short breath of time after checking those numbers, I had imagined relief. No more worries about bills, about the cracked shingles on the roof, about the worn tires on my old truck. I thought maybe life had finally handed me mercy. But mercy doesn't last long in a world where greed walks on two legs and calls you Dad. Michael's voice cut through the room, sharp and urgent. Hand it over. Don't make me fight you for it. I looked at him, my son, my flesh and blood, and saw nothing of the boy I used to carry on my shoulders. Nothing of the teenager I once taught to drive down long, empty highways. His face was tight with hunger, not for food, but for the power that money brings. Samantha's eyes, cold and calculating, never left my hand. Killing. No, I said. My voice sounded older than my body, but steady. It's mine, and I won't give it to you. For a moment, silence filled the kitchen. The fridge hummed. Samantha tapped her fingernails against the counter like a clock ticking down to violence. Michael stepped closer, the shadow of his frame falling over me. Blindness. You're too old to manage something like this? Samantha finally hissed. You'll waste it. We'll make it work. Give it to us. I shook my head. The ticket crinkled under the pressure of my grip. That sound, small as it was, felt louder than their voices. Michael's eyes narrowed. I recognized that look, the same glare he wore as a child when losing a game. But now he was a man, and the stakes were higher. His hand clamped around my wrist, hard enough to make me gasp. He wrenched, twisting in pain, shot like lightning up my arm. Stop fighting me, Samantha said, almost mockingly. Just let it go. But I didn't. I couldn't. My entire life had been about holding on. Through years of long-haul driving, through the nights Mary Ellen coughed herself to sleep, through the loneliness that followed her death. Holding on was all I knew. Michael growled. His grip tightened, and then it happened. A crack, sickening, final, split the air. White-hot agony burst through me as the bone gave way. My scream filled the kitchen, raw and unguarded, bouncing off the faded wallpaper and worn floorboards. The world swam, but my fist did not open. The ticket remained trapped against my chest, clenched in fingers that no longer obeyed me. Tay, Michael shouted, but I couldn't tell if it was anger or panic. Samantha's face hovered, blurred by tears and pain. My vision dimmed, narrowing to a tunnel. Each breath was a battle, each second stretched thin. Yet still I clutched the prize they tried to steal. The room tilted. I collapsed into the chair, my broken arms screaming with every heartbeat. The yellow light above me flickered once, twice, then steadied, as though the house itself bore witness to what had just been done. I thought it would end there, that I would fade into black with nothing left but betrayal. But faintly at first, then sharper, cutting through the fog, came a sound that didn't belong to this kitchen or to my pain. Sirens, high and shrill, growing louder, rushing down the street until they pierced every corner of my spinning mind. The wail reached my doorstep. The sound of an ambulance screamed outside the door. Wilmington, that in my home, but in a white, sterile room. Dream. The whiteness pressing in from every side, the soft hum of machines, the sharp smell of disinfectant that burned the back of my throat. But the weight on my chest, the ache in my lungs, and above all the fire that throbbed in my broken arm reminded me that this was no dream. The kitchen was gone, the lamp, the wallpaper, the ticket clutched to my chest, all replaced by the unyielding walls of a hospital room. I tried to move, but pain pinned me flat against the mattress. My arm was swaddled in plaster, hoisted slightly on a pillow, the skin beneath swollen and throbbing. I could hear my own breath, ragged and uneven. For 72 years, I had weathered storms on endless highways, slept in truck stops with engines roaring around me, buried my wife in the cold earth of Tulsa. Yet I had never felt as alone as I did at that moment, surrounded by people in uniforms who looked at me with polite detachment. Time passed in fragments. The squeak of rubber soles in the hallway, the distant clang of a food cart, the steady beeping of a monitor by my bed. No family sat beside me. No familiar face appeared in the doorway. The loneliness seeped into my bones deeper than the pain. It was then she came in. A nurse, middle-aged, her hair pinned neatly, glasses slipping a little on her nose. Her badge read, Clara. She checked my IV, adjusted the blanket, her hands steady, practiced. Yet, unlike the others, she paused. She looked not just at the cast, but at the bruises flowering across my skin. The dark fingerprint marks on my wrist, the mottled purple along my shoulder. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "What happened to you, Mr. Green?" she asked softly. I turned my face away. My lips moved, but no words came out. Shame choked me. To admit it aloud would be to etch the betrayal into stone. Finally, in a voice raw and low, I whispered, "It was my son." Like a confession. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't dismiss it with the usual explanations of accidents or falls that others might. Instead, she placed her hand gently on the rail of my bed and said, "I see." Her tone carried no doubt, only quiet resolve. She reached for her clipboard. "I'll make a note in your file," she said, almost under her breath. "It matters." Those two words, "it matters," hit me harder than any of the blows in my kitchen. To hear a stranger believe me, when I knew my own blood would call me senile or delusional, was a strange kind of mercy. My throat tightened. For the first time since that terrible night, I felt less invisible. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of the machines fill the silence. Memories of Mary Ellen drifted through. Her hand on mine when I was sick. The soft way she'd say my name. She had been gone for years, yet in Clara's brief compassion, I caught a faint echo of my wife's presence. But peace never lasts long. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and hurried. Clara looked up, her expression shifting into the careful neutrality of professionals. She stepped aside just as the door swung open. Michael walked in, his arm around Samantha, their faces painted with masks of worry. Their voices overlapped in rehearsed sympathy, dripping with false sweetness. "Dad, we came as soon as we heard," Michael said. "We were so scared for you." Samantha leaned forward, her hand grazing my blanket. "You poor thing, what on earth happened?" The bile rose in my throat. I knew the truth. Clara knew it too. Yet here they stood, pretending to care. As if they hadn't been the ones who put me here. Michael and Samantha appeared, feigning concern. They smiled at me across the table, but beneath it, I saw Samantha's nails dig into my son's skin. Professional was brighter that evening than it had been the night I nearly died. I had set the table myself, slow and careful, with the chipped plates Mary Ellen had once chosen, the ones I had never replaced. Outside, autumn air clung to the windows, and through the thin curtains I could see the neighbor's porch light flicker. I had invited a few of the men, old friends, men and women who had known me long enough to remember when I still drove a truck across the Midwest. I thought their presence might steady me, give me a sense of family that my own children had stolen. Michael sat on one side, his posture stiff, but his smile practiced. Samantha, beside him, leaned close, as if the two of them were a portrait of devoted concern. But I saw her nails, sharp and painted, pressing crescents into Michael's wrist, every time he twitched, every time his mask slipped. Their smiles were too wide, their voices too sweet. It was theater, and I was the unwilling audience. I cleared my throat. The scrape of silverware quieted. My heart thudded like an old engine. As I said, "I have something to share. You all know about the lottery. Well, it was my ticket. I won." There was a ripple across the table. Gasps, laughter, chairs shifting. One neighbor clapped me on the back, his face alight with congratulations. For a brief moment, pride warmed me. After all these years of scraping by, of living small, of bearing the woman I loved with nothing but debt at my back, fortune had finally bent my way. Then Samantha rose slightly in her chair, glass in hand, her tone a perfect imitation of delight. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said. "Walter promised us he'd share a few million just to make sure his son and I are secure." The words struck me like ice water. I blinked, stunned, my mouth half open. Around the table, neighbors exchanged glances. A buzz of whispers ran down the line, doubt and envy braided together. "I never said that," I managed, my voice breaking under the weight of disbelief. "Take." But Samantha's eyes glittered. She touched her phone, screen glowing faintly. "Oh, but you did," she said. "Here, let me remind you." A video played, grainy but damning. My own voice came out of the speaker, distorted but unmistakable. "I'll give you some of it, I promise." The room tilted. My stomach clenched. I remembered the moment she had cornered me, asking innocent questions while her phone recorded. The audio had been twisted, stitched together like a trap. And now, here, in front of neighbors who had known me for decades, it was being held up as truth. Gasps rose again, but these sounded different, harder, sharper. A woman at the end of the table muttered, "I always thought he was generous. Guess I was wrong." Another man frowned at me, disappointment plain in his eyes. I tried to speak, to explain, but the noise drowned me out. Michael said nothing. He let Samantha do the work, his silence a heavier accusation than any words. My throat tightened. Rage and shame collided inside me, leaving me hollow. My wife's photograph still hung in the hallway. I imagined her eyes watching this humiliation unfold, watching our neighbors look at me not as a man but as a liar. Silence. Didio ended. Silence settled, heavy and suffocating. Samantha smiled sweetly, as though she had only confirmed what everyone deserved to know. I turned my gaze down the table, searching for a single face that might still believe me. None met my eyes. Even the ones who had toasted me moments earlier now avoided my stare. Walter looked and saw himself turned into a liar. They didn't need sticks anymore, only papers and a stamp. The office was colder than the November wind outside. A polished wooden desk stretched wide between me and the man in a dark suit, his tie knotted too tight, his smile too quick. Law books lined the shelves, but they looked untouched, more decoration than knowledge. The air smelled faintly of leather and ink, but underneath lingered something sharper. The quiet calculation of people who deal in signatures and power. Michael guided me to a chair as if he were a dutiful son. His hand on my elbow was steady, almost gentle, though I could still remember how that same hand had wrenched my wrist until the bone cracked. My cast was heavy, itching beneath the plaster, my fingers swollen and purple. Every time I shifted in the chair, pain throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat. Samantha sat close, her posture upright, eyes bright with practiced sympathy. She had a stack of papers in front of her, neatly clipped, the lawyer sliding them across the desk one by one. Their voices flowed together, warm on the surface, but each word carried the chill of intent. "It's just a formality, Mr. Green," the lawyer said. His pen glided between his fingers like a blade. "You've come into sudden wealth, and it's best to place the assets under guardianship. Your son and daughter-in-law can help manage them responsibly." Michael leaned forward. "Dad, this is how people protect themselves. You can't possibly keep track of all that money alone." I stared at the pages. The print swam before my eyes. Dense, legal jargon. You wouldn't want to risk losing your fortune through mismanagement, would you? The cast on my arm itched, the pain steady and merciless. I felt my breath falter, my chest tightening, but I forced myself upright. My hand trembled as I pushed the papers back across the desk. "No," I said again, louder this time, each syllable vibrating through the hollow room. My broken arm quivered, but I lifted it anyway, plaster white and awkward, a monument to the violence already done. My voice cracked but carried. "I will not sign." Grandparents that followed was heavier than any blow. Michael's face flushed, anger seeping through the cracks of his control. Samantha's smile froze. For the first time, I saw the mask slip just enough to reveal the fury beneath. I rose to my feet, slow but deliberate. Pain shot through me as I straightened, but I didn't look away. My cast trembled in the air between us, more declaration than weapon. My son stared, but I held his gaze until he faltered. He left the papers on the desk, untouched, unclaimed. The room seemed to shrink as I walked to the door, each step a reminder that they could not yet take everything from me. Kissed behind me, Samantha's voice rose, cold and sharp as glass. The sound of her phone snapping open cut the silence. "He's not well," she said, venom wrapped in sugar. "He's lost his mind. Freeze the accounts. Now." I became a millionaire only on paper. The bank looked at me as if I were incapable. Smelled of stale coffee and polished floors, the kind of artificial cleanliness that always felt more like a mask than a comfort. The lobby hummed with muted conversations, the shuffle of papers, the soft ding of a printer somewhere behind the counter. I stood in line with my arm heavy in plaster, my chest tight, holding the little folder where I had carefully placed the winning ticket and the letters the lottery commission had sent me. Proof, I thought. All the proof in the world. Tia. When it was my turn, I stepped to the counter where a young man in a suit too sharp for his years greeted me with the sort of smile people wear when they're already tired of listening. His name tag read Anderson. He tapped the keys on his computer, asked for my identification, then frowned at the screen. "I'm sorry, Mr. Green," he said, voice clipped, rehearsed. "Your accounts have been frozen. I'll need to refer you to our compliance team." My stomach dropped. "Frozen?" I repeated, the word foreign in my mouth. "Yes, sir," Anderson said, glancing at the cast on my arm as though it explained everything. "There's been a claim of diminished capacity filed under your name. Until the bank reviews it, you won't be able to access your funds." The world slowed. Behind me, I felt the weight of people shifting in line, impatience mounting. My tongue clung to the roof of my mouth. "By who?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that, sir," he replied, though the flicker in his eyes told me he knew. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You should consider appointing a legal guardian. It would make this process much smoother." Guang, as if I were a child, as if 72 years of labor and scars and nights alone on the road meant nothing. My chest burned, not with the broken bone this time, but with humiliation so deep it cut like fire. "Ian!" I don't need a guardianling with contained rage. Anderson's smile remained fixed, but his tone softened in that way people do when they think they're speaking to someone whose mind has slipped away. "Sir, we just want to protect your assets." Wanted to tell him about the miles I'd driven, the nights and blizzards when the only thing between me and death was my stubborn will. I wanted to remind him that this fortune was mine, not his, not my son's, not Samantha's. But words felt useless in that place, drowned beneath the quiet hum of air conditioning and the clack of keyboards. I gathered my papers, my good hand trembling, the cast thudding against the counter as I shoved everything back into the folder. Anderson gave me a sympathetic nod, the kind reserved for the senile, and moved on to the next customer. Walking out of the bank, the autumn air struck me sharper than before. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing heavily, my broken arm cradled against my chest, the folder pressed close like a shield. I realized then that proof alone meant nothing if those in power refused to see it. For a long moment, I simply stood there, people flowing past me on their errands, the world spinning on as though I had already been erased. Then I made a decision. If their voices would always drown out mine, then I would make sure mine was preserved in ways they couldn't twist. Every word, every conversation, every sneer, they would all be captured. I would no longer rely on memory alone. From that day forward, I promised myself I would record everything. My truth would have a witness, even if it had to be a machine. My phone buzzed in my pocket, vibrating against my leg. I pulled it out, the screen glowing with a name I hadn't seen in years. Pastor John. Stabilize. In church, I heard the prayers, but all I could hear inside was the crack of bone from that night. Squeezed him rose and fell in waves around me, voices blending into a familiar harmony. The pew beneath me was worn smooth by decades of devotion, the wood creaking under my weight as I shifted my cast against my chest. Light poured through stained glass windows, scattering colors onto the floor like shards of hope. Yet no matter how the choir sang, no matter how the congregation swayed with reverence, I could not leave behind the memory of that night, the sound of my son breaking me, the sharp betrayal that still rang louder than any prayer. I bowed my head with the others, my lips moving silently, though no words reached my tongue. I felt like an intruder in my own faith, a man carrying secrets too heavy for a holy place. When the service ended, I remained seated, staring at the crucifix above the altar, until footsteps drew near. Pastor John Miller, a man I had known since Mary Ellen and I first came to Tulsa, placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. His face bore the years in deep creases, but his eyes were kind, steady. "Walter," he said, lowering his voice, "you've been absent too long. I worried." I looked down at my cast, the bandages peeking from beneath the plaster. My throat ached. "I've had troubles." He studied me, waiting for more. But I couldn't tell him everything. The shame was too fresh, the betrayal too raw. To say aloud that my own son had tried to break me open like a safe was something I couldn't yet manage. Still, something in my silence told him enough. "Take whatever it is," John said, his tone calm but firm. "Truth has a way of rising. Don't let them silence you." I forced a thin smile, though my stomach churned. "What if no one believes me?" He leaned closer. "Then you keep the proof. If it is true, keep the evidence. One day the world will have no choice but to see." His words settled into me like embers. For weeks I had stumbled between humiliation and despair. Now, for the first time, the thought of fighting back took root. Not with fists, not with anger, but with something stronger. As the congregation drifted out, John slipped his hand into his pocket. He glanced over his shoulder, as though ensuring no one else lingered, then pressed something small and cold into my palm. I looked down. A tiny camera, no bigger than a thumb, the red light hidden, its lens barely visible. "Gift from a parishioner," he murmured. "They said it was too much gadget for them. I think you might find a use." I stared at it, my chest tightening. It felt heavier than it was, as though the little device carried with it a chance to restore what had been stolen. "John," I whispered, but he only patted my arm gently. "Use it wisely," he said. "When the time comes, let the truth speak for you." I closed my fist around the camera, feeling the weight of both burden and hope. For the first time since the hospital, I sensed a path forward, narrow but real. As I stepped out into the sunlight, the autumn air sharp on my face, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it free, expecting a message from the bank, maybe a note from Clara checking in. Instead, the screen lit up with Michael's name. I answered, my voice guarded. Brigham came low, heavy, like a warning. "We need to talk, one last time." Unfirst light, no bigger than a grain of rice, illuminated their entire faces. The house felt different that night. I had drawn the curtains, but the shadows still crept in, long and heavy across the floorboards. The air was taut, as though it too was waiting for something to break. My cast itched, my arm pulsed with every heartbeat, but I forced myself to sit upright at the table, phone at my side, the small camera John had given me hidden in the corner among a clutter of old magazines. Its red eye was faint, invisible unless you knew where to look. I had barely settled when the door swung open without a knock. Michael and Samantha filled the doorway, their presence as suffocating as the dark. Michael wore a forced grin, but his eyes were restless. Samantha, on the other hand, looked calm, too calm, the kind of calm that hides barbed wire beneath silk. "Dad," Michael said, dropping into the chair across from me. "We came to make peace." Samantha slid beside him, her tone honeyed. "We don't want to fight anymore. We just want to help you handle this money. You can't deny that you need us." I sat still, breathing slowly, watching them. Their performance was rehearsed. Michael leaned in with false warmth, his voice lowering as if the neighbors could hear through the walls. "If you just give us access, we'll make sure you're comfortable for the rest of your life." I let the silence stretch. The camera's light burned in the corner, quiet and patient, capturing every word. When I didn't respond, Samantha's smile slipped. Her nails drummed against the table. "Don't be stubborn," she said sharply. "Everyone knows you promised to share. The community is already talking." Her words stabbed at me, but I kept my expression blank. The urge to shout rose in my throat, yet I swallowed it down. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, letting the cast rest on the armrest, as though I were just too tired to argue. The act bought me time. The camera blinked silently, bearing witness. Michael's voice cracked. You think you can handle this alone? Look at you. You're weak. You're old. You couldn't even protect yourself in your own kitchen. His eyes darted to my broken arm. Heat rushed through me, but I didn't move. They wanted anger, a slip of control. What they got instead was stillness. My silence was sharper than any blade. Samantha suddenly stood, circling the table. Her perfume lingered in the air, sweet and cloying, but her words cut bitter. Do you want to know what people are saying? That you're losing your mind, that the money would be better in the hands of people who know what to do with it, us. She leaned close, her face inches from mine. Give it up before you lose everything. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze. For a moment, we stared at one another, the room shrinking to that single exchange. Then, without warning, she shoved me backward. The chair rocked, my body tipping hard, pain exploding through my arm as I crashed against the floor. My head smacked the corner of the table, stars bursting across my vision. Their voices blurred, rising, then fading, but the sound that mattered was already captured. The scrape of the chair, my groan, Samantha's harsh words spilling like venom. I lay there gasping, forcing myself not to let go of control. I reached for the edge of the table, pulling myself upright inch by inch, my cast dragging like dead weight. Michael muttered, "This is pointless," and stormed toward the door. Samantha followed, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. The door slammed, rattling the old frame. When silence finally returned, I lifted my good hand and pulled the tiny camera from its hiding place. The red light still glowed, steady, alive. I stroked it gently with my thumb, whispering to myself, to the empty house, and maybe to Mary Ellen too. Enough. When the older are called senile, the law is the only cane they can lean on. The community legal office sat between a pawn shop and a laundromat, its doorbell coughing a tired jingle when I stepped inside. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The waiting chairs were mismatched, cushion seams frayed from years of bodies sinking into them with the same mixture of hope and dread. I held my small folder against my ribs and kept my broken arm close, the cast resting like a blunt reminder of everything I could no longer lift without pain. A receptionist with kind eyes asked my name and waved me through. In the back office, a young man rose from behind a keyboarded fortress of case files. He couldn't have been 40. A loosened tie, rolled sleeves, the quick, attentive gaze of someone who listens professionally and then keeps listening after the clock says to stop. "Mr. Green, I'm Ethan Walker." He didn't reach for my injured hand, just nodded me toward a chair. "Take your time." Constrained, I set the folder down and with my good hand added the little camera to the pile. Its lens looked dull in the office light, unremarkable, like any other gadget forgotten in a drawer. I told him about the bank calling me incompetent, about the paper trap in the lawyer's office, about a kitchen that used to be a refuge and now felt like a crime scene. I told him less than the whole, but enough for a picture to form. A father, a son, and money that pulled the mask off love. "Do you have recordings?" he asked gently. I tapped the folder. Video from my living room, audio from calls, times, dates. I started keeping a log. My voice shook on the last word. It is a terrible thing to log your own life like evidence. Ethan powered up a small drive, slid in the card, and watched, head tilted, hands folded, not interrupting. I kept my eyes on the window where sunlit lint hovered in the air like slow snow. From the speakers came their voices, smooth at first, then jagged. The scrape of my chair, the thud of my body hitting the floor, Samantha's soft, satisfied breath after the shove. When the clip ended, he exhaled, long and low. "Mr. Green," he said, "I believe you." Thing in my chest I hadn't realized was bound. In this small office, belief landed heavier than pity, steadier than outrage. Belief is a handrail. He flipped open a legal pad. "Here's what we'll do. I'll open a file, we'll secure copies of everything, off-site and cloud. We'll draft affidavits while the details are still fresh. We'll petition to lift the freeze and challenge any guardianship claims. But," he paused, pen hovering, "people like your son and his wife don't just push once, they escalate." "I know," I said. My voice sounded older than the chair beneath me. He nodded. "Then we prepare for the long road." He showed me a checklist. Dates, names, medical records, A request to the hospital for injury documentation. The nurse's note I prayed Clara had entered. We rehearsed what I should say if the bank called again, what I shouldn't say when anger burned hot and stupid behind my teeth. He asked for the names of neighbors who'd watched Samantha play innocent at Sunday dinner. I gave them, ashamed and grateful at the same time. Mr. Green, he said after a while, I want you to hear this clearly. Your age is not a defect. It's only a fact. The law doesn't hand your voice to other people because birthdays pass. We're going to contest every inch they've taken. I swallowed. What if the community only hears their version? He was silent for a beat, then turned the legal pad around so I could see what he had scrawled in quick square letters. Let the community see the truth. He tapped the page. We need to go public. It can't just be paperwork. The sentence rang through the room like struck glass. I thought of the sanctuary's colored light, the hush before a hymn, the way a congregation can be a mirror that finally tells the truth. Pastor John had placed the camera in my palm like a sacrament. A stage had been waiting all along. I just hadn't stepped onto it. Ethan leaned back. I'm not talking about spectacle. I'm talking about daylight. A statement from you, corroborated by the records and the footage. You pick the place. Courtroom, town hall, church potluck, anywhere your neighbors will be forced to look you in the eyes again. Predators thrive in private. I stared at my cast. The plaster had absorbed a little of my sweat. The smell was faint and sour like old chalk. If we do this, they'll come harder, I said. They will, he answered. And when they do, they'll leave footprints. We made copies then, video to 2 drives, audio files stamped with time, my paper log scanned page by meticulous page. He sealed one set in a manila envelope and pushed it across the desk. Keep this on you. If anyone demands it, say you've already filed it, which, by the way, we will by morning. A knock sounded at the outer door. The receptionist murmured something I couldn't catch. Ethan kept his eyes on me, and in that small refusal to be hurried, I felt the respect of a man treating a 72-year-old not as a problem but as a client. I stood, tucking the envelope inside my jacket like a warm brick. The camera went back into my pocket, the lens cold against my fingertips. I felt strangely steady, still hurt, still tired, but upright in a way I hadn't been since the night my kitchen swallowed my cry. The hallway outside his office carried the smells of toner and burnt coffee. I had one hand on the knob when the door shadowed over and opened outward as if pulled by a gust. But there was no wind in that windowless hall, only a familiar outline filling the frame, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes already scanning for advantage. Michael appeared unexpectedly at the office door, someone's eyes on my back. Farudgah had folded over Tulsa by the time I turned down my street. The sidewalks were empty, the kind of quiet that amplifies every small sound. The tick of my truck's cooling engine, the dry rasp of leaves along the curb, the faint rattle of a loose gutter somewhere down the block. I stood for a moment at the foot of my walkway, the cast heavy against my ribs, and let the chill steady me. Then I saw it, the rear gate ajar, the slat that never slips now, hanging crooked as if a hurried hand had forced it. I moved slower than I once did, but I moved. The back steps complained under my weight. The kitchen door's latch was bent, bright metal exposed where paint had flaked away. A draft breathed through the seam, carrying in the smell of dust and a stranger's cologne. Inside, the light switch clicked uselessly. I didn't need it. The moon did enough. Drawers gaped like mouths. The bread box was open. Recipe cards spilled like paper feathers. The little tin where Mary Ellen kept stamps lay dented on the floor. They were looking for the camera or the drives or the notebook I had started the day the bank called me incompetent. They were looking for my memory. I set my jaw and began the first sweep, the way I used to check a trailer's locks before a long haul. The false bottom in the pantry was untouched. The manila envelope was still there. I slid it into my jacket. In the bedroom, I pulled the shoebox from the back of the closet and fed it with everything that mattered. The spare SD card, the printed log, the copy of the ER report, the names of neighbors who had watched Samantha lie and said nothing. The box felt too light for what it held. Evidence never weighs what it's worth. On my way back to the kitchen, I stopped at the hallway photo. Mary Ellen's smile had ride-worn edges now from so much remembering. All right, I told her in the quiet. We're going to move this out of reach. I cracked the door and listened. The street held its breath. Then, from the far side of the hedge, the burn of a cigarette bloomed. Brief, ember red, then gone. A figure stood near the streetlight, just outside its circle. Shoulders I knew, a stance I'd corrected 100 times when he was learning to throw a ball. Smoke lifted, then drifted toward me, thin and sour. He looked straight at the house as if he could peel the walls back with his eyes. I waited until the cigarette pinched to a star and dropped. The man grounded under his shoe, heel turning with the slow patience that used to mean concentration and now meant something else. The ash left a tiny gray crescent at the edge of the light. I exhaled and moved. The shoebox went into a grocery bag, the bag into the cab of my truck. I kept the camera on me, the engine coughed awake. The figure didn't flinch, didn't approach, only watched. As I pulled from the curb, his face turned enough for the light to sketch the line of his jaw. The boy was gone. What the money had found was the man he had chosen to become. The church sat dark on the corner like a ship at anchor. I parked around back, where the wind kept the alley clean. The side door was locked, but the mail slot by the office had enough give. I fed the envelope through, listening for the dull slide of paper on wood as it landed inside. The bag with the shoebox I hid beneath the metal stairs, behind the utility pipe where rain rarely reaches. My breath fogged in the cold. The fog vanished quickly, as if the night were erasing me. I stood there longer than I needed to, letting the quiet test my resolve. The church had always been a place for my knees. Now it was a vault. If they wanted the record of my life, they'd have to take it from a place that had held more mourning and mercy than Michael or Samantha had ever understood. On the drive home, I took the long way, circling blocks I'd known for decades. In my side mirror, a pair of headlights appeared, then fell back, then returned. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. I turned again, letting the route knot upon itself, until the lights peeled away to chase some other quarry. My kitchen still smelled of someone else's hands. I set a new wedge beneath the door and taped cardboard over the broken pane, then sat with my back to the wall and the camera on the table. I thought of Ethan's square handwriting, "Let the community see the truth," and of Pastor John's palm closing mine around that little machine as if it were a sacrament. They had taken so much already: the use of my arm, my name in the mouths of neighbors, the steadiness of sleep. They would not take the witness. A sound outside drew me up again. I parted the curtain with 2 fingers. Across the street, under the streetlight's tired halo, he had returned. Shoulders squared, head tilted, no pretense now. Michael took another drag, the coal brightening, then lifted his chin as if to make sure I could see he was seeing me. We stood like that, 2 fixed points, until his cigarette burned to nothing. He dropped it and pressed his heel. The ash made another gray moon beside the first. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it free, expecting a bank email or one more useless warning from the security company. Instead, the screen lit with a message that cut through the thrum in my chest and settled everything that could be settled tonight. Pastor John texted, "This Sunday, let me handle it." When the screen lit up inside the church, I heard gasps roll back like thunder. Sexuales groaned under the weight of Sunday bodies, coats pressed tight, hymnals stacked like bricks along the rail. Sunlight fell through stained glass in fractured ribbons, wine red, river blue, spilling across the aisle where I sat with my cast tucked close to my chest. I kept my eyes on the altar cloth, on the white that refused to be stained by any of this. Pastor John's voice carried low and steady through the opening prayer, but it was the hush beneath his words that told me the room already knew. News travels faster than grace. When the amen faded, John didn't move to the next hymn. He rested both hands on the pulpit and let his gaze pass over faces that had watched me grow old. "Neighbors," he said, "sometimes truth requires light." He nodded toward the fellowship hall cart they'd wheeled up the center aisle. A volunteer plugged in the projector. The wall behind the altar became a pale square, waiting. I could feel Michael before I saw him, the way a storm announces itself in the bones. He and Samantha had chosen seats near the back, angled enough to see the crowd, to measure the room. Samantha's chin lifted as if daring anyone to doubt her. Michael's jaw worked, grinding at a lie he hadn't spoken yet. The machine clicked. A rectangle of gray swelled into color. My kitchen, my table. The old lamp with its weak yellow eye. I heard the scrape of a chair, then my own voice, tired, held calm with both hands. In the pews around me, someone clucked their tongue. Someone else whispered my name. The sound of our town's heart shifted, slow and massive. John said nothing from the pulpit. He didn't have to. The screen did the sermon. Arch the frame first, big and eager, the grin he uses when he wants something stretching thin. Samantha followed, silk over wire. Their words rolled out friendly, then tight, then hard. The camera's tiny microphone caught everything. The click of her nails on the table. The change in air when anger walked in. A man I barely recognized sat on the far side of that table with a plaster-wrapped arm. The congregation leaned forward as if to warm him with their breath. When Michael called me weak, a murmur rose. When I refused to hand over what was mine, a rustle went through the room like wheat in wind. And when Samantha circled the chair, sweetness emptying from her voice, I felt the pew tremble under our shared breath. Then the moment I had both dreaded and needed. Samantha's hand at the back of my chair. The sharp shove, the sudden tilt of the room, the thud of old bone against older floorboards. My groan, God help me, echoing off the walls of my own house. On the screen, Samantha's mouth twisted through a sentence we could not quite hear. In the nave, a woman near the aisle raised her hand to her lips and kept it there, as if she could hold the sound in. No one sang, no one coughed. Even the children were quiet, sensing that adults had wandered somewhere terrible and holy. Pause it, someone whispered, but the video ran on, catching Michael's curse, the slam of their exit, the kitchen falling back into its thin, stunned breathing. When the clip ended, the projector fan spun on for a heartbeat longer, whispering into the silence. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. The crowd did it for me, heads turning toward the rear pew. Samantha stood first, color rising high in her cheeks. "This is doctored," she said, voice too loud for a sanctuary. "You all know how easy it is to fake videos." She swung her arm in a small arc, a courtroom gesture rehearsed in the bathroom mirror. Walter has been confused for months. He forgets things. Pastor John's word felt like a book closing. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "You may speak in due time, Mrs. Carter." "Today we are bearing witness." Male sprang to his feet, pointing, not at the screen, not at me, but at the pastor. "You had no right to show that," his voice cracked. A few men in the choir loft shifted forward, not aggressive, not passive, simply present. John looked out over the pews. If harm lives in shadows, we turn on the light. If a neighbor is hurt, we stand with him in daylight. Around me, something old and sturdy moved through the congregation, the sense of a town remembering what it was for. A deacon laid her hand on my shoulder and squeezed. The Rogers boy, who mows lawns all summer long, stared at the screen with a fury he didn't yet know how to name. I saw Mrs. McKay, who once brought a casserole when Mary Ellen was dying, press tears back with the heel of her palm. 1063 nodded to the volunteer. The image returned. The shove played again, this time with no noise from the pews to soften it, and the scream, mine, ripped through the church, a clean tear in linen. People flinched. A man near the center aisle whispered, "Lord have mercy." Freeze's denial shrank under the weight of what the room had seen together. Michael's shoulders dropped, not in humility, but in calculation, as if measuring exits. The light on the wall showed my kitchen one last time, then went to black. The sanctuary seemed to inhale. Hands moved to pockets, phones lifted, heads bowed together in clusters, as if for impromptu prayer. But it wasn't prayer. It was contact lists, text threads, the first ripples of a community deciding where it stood. Somewhere in the nave a chair scraped. Somewhere in the balcony a hinge squealed open to let in fresh air. I kept my hands folded. The cast itched, but felt lighter than it had in weeks. I didn't speak. The truth had spoken its own name aloud, and that was enough for now. From the vestibule, a bell jangled, and footsteps quickened. Someone had already called. A shape moved behind the frosted glass doors, blue flicker cutting across the hall windows, washing the stained glass saints in a cold second sunrise. Cling sirens wailed outside the door. colder than the look my son gave me. Tall fluorescent lights buzzed over the intake desk, washing the station in a tired official glare. I sat with my cast resting on a clipboard while a sergeant typed, pausing only to ask me to spell a name or confirm a date. Ethan sat beside me, patient as a metronome, a stack of labeled drives in his briefcase and copies of everything: hospital report, bank logs, the kitchen video, ready in triplicate. We watched the footage of View Room. The sound was tinny, but the truth didn't mind cheap speakers. When my chair scraped and I fell, the sergeant stopped the video and wrote for a long time. "We'll need statements from the congregation," he said, pastor included. Ethan already had a list. They brought Michael and Samantha in through the side door. No performance left, just calculation and anger. Michael's wrists were ringed in steel, the chain whispering when he moved. He stared at me as if staring could erase evidence. Santa's hands were free, but her voice worked like a blade. "This is harassment," she snapped. "He's confused. He doesn't remember what he says from one day to the next." Ethan slid an envelope across the table. "Medical documentation of injuries, prior reports of account interference, audio confirming intent to coerce. We're alleging assault and attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." Closet surged half out of his chair and a deputy's hand landed on his shoulder, firm and professional. The cuffs clicked tighter. He winced and then found me again with his eyes, the same eyes that once searched the outfield for a fly ball I'd lobbed too high. I looked back and didn't move. Position a last angle, the one that always felt like sand in the mouth. Samantha leaned toward the sergeant, voice suddenly soft. "He's not competent. He's senile." Silence gathered itself. Ethan didn't answer. The sergeant didn't either. He only turned the notebook toward me and asked, "Mr. Green, can you walk me through the timeline one more time? Dates and calls?" I breathed in, slow. The station smelled of coffee and winter coats. Memory, when you tend it, stops being a wound and becomes a tool. I reached into my jacket, the cast scraping the arm of the chair, and felt cardboard corners worn smooth by weeks of use. I smiled and took out the journal where I'd written everything, day by day. I have $79 million, but the only thing I hold tight is memory. My house breathed differently after the sirens and statements, as if the old boards had unclenched. Morning light came clean through the blinds and laid itself across the kitchen table where so much of this began. The cast itched where my skin was learning the shape of itself again. I set a mug of coffee by the photo of Mary Ellen and traced the air beside her cheek, the way I used to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear before I left for the road. Money can buy quiet windows and new shingles. It cannot buy the sound of her laughing at the radio, or the way she'd press my lunch into my hands like a blessing. Those I keep without banks. I opened the folder Ethan prepared. Not the evidence one, that stayed under lock, but the other, papers that pointed my fortune away from the mouths that had tried to swallow it. A scholarship in Mary Ellen's name for kids who come from houses smaller than their hope. A fund for the hospital wing where the night nurses walk circles while families sleep. A small grant for the food pantry that never asks a man to prove his hunger. I read each page slowly as if reading vows. Before noon, we met at his office with a notary who smelled of winter coats and peppermint. Ethan reviewed the instruments in his calm, squared-off voice. Irrevocable trusts, designated trustees who were not kin, spend provisions that turned mine into ours. I listened and I nodded. I asked my one question the way a man checks the straps on a load before the highway. "When I'm gone, does this stay put?" "It stays," Ethan said, tapping the clause. "No one can pry it loose." I thought of Samantha's shove, of Michael's stare beneath the streetlight, of a congregation holding its breath while a screen told the truth. I thought, too, of Aunt Martha from long ago, who once slipped us a jar of coins and said, "It isn't much, but it's from the part of me that's mine." I uncapped the pen. The notary slid the first document forward. The paper felt heavier than it looked. I set my hand, this good hand that had learned, late, what it must hold and what it must release, and wrote my name where the line waited. The nib scratched like a match. Another document, another signature. The pen warmed under my grip. By the last page, my chest had loosened. Something that had been hooked there for months let go and sank away. As done, Ethan stamped and sealed. The notary embossed the edges so hard the page rose with a white halo. I gathered the copies and tucked them into a new folder, different from the one that had carried my hurt. This one carried what would remain when I did not. Back home, the late afternoon tilted amber. I brewed tea in Mary Ellen's chip pot and sat at the table, the trust packet beside the photograph. I told her what I'd done, out loud, because the walls already knew my private sounds and did not judge. You taught kids who had nothing but courage, I said. Now some of them will have books too. In the quiet that followed, my house felt like a promise kept. The phone sat face down near the cup, screen dark, a small mirror of nothing. I reached for my journal instead and wrote a line I wanted to remember if doubt ever returned. Money can forget you. Memory never does. I underlined it once, then twice, the way pastors underline a word they mean on Sunday. The phone rang. Emily, my granddaughter, calling to apologize. When they realized they had lost everything, tears could buy them nothing. The courtroom smelled of old wood and dusted files, the kind of place where stories are stripped of sentiment until only facts remain. I sat stiff in the witness pew, my cast heavy though the bone beneath had begun to knit. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, laying rectangles of pale gold across the floor, but nothing could soften the hard faces of the deputies flanking the defendant's table. Michael's suit sagged, as if it had borrowed him instead of the other way around. Samantha's hair was immaculate, but her eyes darted, brittle, searching for exits that did not exist. They no longer had neighbors to charm, no kitchen table to dominate, only charges, pages long: elder abuse, assault, attempted financial fraud, conspiracy, words that stacked into walls they could not climb. So the prosecutor laid out the evidence: the video, the recordings, the bank interference, the testimony of Pastor John, of Nurse Clara, of Ethan with his precise files. Each piece landed like hammer strokes. Michael twitched. Samantha bit her lip until it blanched. Their attorney raised objections, but the judge, gray-haired and deliberate, waved them down like flies. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. The room waited. The weight of months pressed on me, yet I felt steady. I looked at the bench, not at my son, not at the woman who had turned him crueler than he already was. My voice, when it came, was low but clear. I forgive them, but the law does not. Silence followed, thick and echoing. Forgiveness was my choice. Judgment was the court's. The line between the two stood taller than either of them could cross. The judge leaned forward, glasses balanced on the edge of his nose. He read from the verdict sheet with the cadence of a tolling bell. Guilty on all counts. Sentences measured in years. Restitution. No appeal that would blunt the truth. Samantha gasped and clutched the table. Michael lowered his head into his cuffed hands. Tears fell, but they found no purchase. The gavel struck once, sharp as a door slamming. It was over. I rose, slower than the deputies escorting them out, and made my way through the side aisle. The doors opened, and light poured in. Warm, late afternoon sunlight, richer than gold, carrying with it the sound of a town alive beyond stone walls. I stepped outside. The sun touched my face. Her name was engraved on the brass plaque, shining brighter than the 79 million. Prometheus Hall smelled of lemon oil and fresh paper programs. Folding chairs lined the room in neat rows, every seat taken, the aisles crowded with neighbors who had carried us through births and funerals and long winters. At the front, a velvet curtain hid a small plaque bolted to the wall, and beside it waited a podium with a microphone that crackled softly, as if clearing its throat before the first hymn. I stood with my cast, close to my ribs, feeling the steadying weight of it, a reminder of where this road began and why it had to end here. Pastor John opened with a prayer that asked nothing for himself and everything for the children of this town. Ethan stood a step behind me, sleeves rolled, eyes bright, the legal language done at last, the ink long dry. On a table near the podium sat a stack of envelopes. First scholarships in the name of the woman who taught shy second graders how to make brave sentences. Mary Ellen Green. I mouthed the letters while the choir hummed a wordless blessing. When the curtain drew back, the plaque caught the light and threw it back across the room. Mary Ellen's name, the dates of her life, and a single line beneath. For every child whose courage outruns their means. Applause rose like a tide. It wasn't loud the way football games are loud. It was full, like a room standing up inside its own chest. Children at the front row tried to clap in rhythm, missing it and laughing, then trying again. A girl with a ribbon in her hair leaned forward and sounded the syllables slowly. May, re, el, len, as if learning a new hymn. John spoke of classrooms with too few books, and of a woman who stayed late to mend them with tape and patience. Ethan explained, plain and careful, how the fund would work. Tuition checks cut on time, no hoops crueler than hunger, trustees who answered to daylight. People nodded, some crying quietly, some holding their breath, as if afraid to blow the moment away. I asked if I would say a word. I gripped the podium with my good hand and listened to the microphone settle. My wife believed that kindness is not the opposite of strength, I said. It is its proof. Today we turn numbers into names and names into chances. That is what money is for when it remembers who we are. I didn't mean to cry. I had practiced not crying for decades, at loading docks, at graveside, in kitchens where the radio filled the silence for both of us. But when the choir began a simple blessing, voices low and close, the room blurred. I let it. Tears found my mouth and tasted like the first sip of water after a long drive. I covered my eyes with the crook of my arm and did not hide. The applause that followed was gentler than the first. Not victory, not pity, recognition. Envelopes changed hands. A boy in a borrowed jacket shook my finger solemnly and said he would make her proud. A teacher pressed my shoulder and whispered that the library would open late again. John squeezed my cast lightly, as if blessing even the broken parts, and Ethan folded the program and slid it into my pocket like a keepsake. The crowd thinned to clusters, laughter lifted, chairs scraped, plates clinked. At the edge of the table where the punch bowl sweated pink circles, a small voice tugged at my sleeve. I turned and a child looked up with grave eyes, the ribbon girl from the front row, hands clasped around her program as if it were a passport. Sir, why did you share the money with us? No more shouting, only the steady tick of the clock on the wall. Settled back into itself, as if the walls had finally exhaled after months of holding their breath. Afternoon light slanted through the blinds, painting slow-moving stripes across the floor. I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and listened for the soft rattle of water just before the boil. The cast on my arm was smaller now, trimmed down as the bone knit back together, the skin beneath pale and tender, but mending. Each day it hurt a little less. Each day it reminded me a little more that healing was not only possible, but inevitable. I laid out the chipped teacup Mary Ellen favored, the one with the fading blue roses along the rim. Steam curled into the air, wrapping the kitchen in warmth, carrying with it the faint memory of her voice humming while she stirred sugar. I let myself look at her photograph on the wall, that half smile she always gave when she knew I was pretending to be stronger than I was. I've done my best, I whispered to her, though only the clock answered. Silence filled the house, not the hostile silence of fear, but the clean silence of peace. I could hear the tick of the clock, the whistle of the kettle cooling, the sound of my own breath rising and falling without strain. I walked slowly to the window, gazed out at the yard where the last of the leaves clung stubbornly to the trees. Freedom had a scent. It was in the crisp air, in the dust motes floating harmlessly in the light, in the absence of footsteps that once approached with violence. Then I sat at the table with my tea and felt my shoulders drop, the tightness that had lived there for months finally letting go. For the first time since Mary Ellen's passing, I smiled without forcing it, a small, unguarded smile that belonged only to the quiet. Relief, fragile but real, spread through me like warmth after a long winter. I reached for my journal, the one that had carried the burden of every day in detail. Dates, times, words, truths that no one could erase. With my good hand, I turned to a fresh page. The ink bled smoothly, steady as my breath. And I wrote a final line, I am no longer afraid of the dark because I have already seen the truth. The church was quieter than it had been on the day of revelation, but the pews were still filled. Neighbors, teachers, families, children who had begun to speak Mary Ellen's name, as though it had always been theirs. The late sun stretched through stained glass and spilled amber light across the altar, bathing the small lectern in color. I stood there with my cast lighter, nearly healed, and my journal closed at last in my pocket. Pastor John introduced me with a nod and then stepped aside. The congregation hushed, waiting. I placed both hands on the lectern, my good one steady, the mended one trembling not with weakness but with release. My voice carried, softer than the hymns but certain. "I share what I have," I said, letting each word hang, "but I do not share it with those who treat me as worthless. Money can be spent, memory cannot. And dignity. Dignity is the only wealth we carry to the grave." Silence held for a heartbeat, then the sound of chairs scraping, feet rising, hands clapping. It was not the applause of spectacle, but of a community finding itself again in the echo of its own compassion. I bowed my head, not in shame, but in gratitude. Through the open window above the choir loft, I saw the sky turning lavender, the evening spreading like paint across canvas. For a moment I saw Mary Ellen there, standing at the threshold of memory, her smile warm as ever, her presence a balm. I closed my eyes, breathed her name, and let the sound dissolve into the choir's steady hum. When I opened them again, the light had shifted. A single beam slipped through the glass and struck the floor at my feet, pure and sharp, as though the truth itself had chosen to stand beside me. The light poured through the stained glass windows,